Indigenous LGBTQ2 spirited journey, building hope and resilience toward reconciliation. We begin our journey in the 1800s when the white man came and took over the Indigenous people's land. The Europeans tried to force the Indigenous to adopt their way of thinking. According to Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada, the white man did this by taking away their land, taking their children, stripping away all their rights, starving them, forcing them into residential schools in an attempt to teach the Indigenous the white man culture, and they did not treat them as even people. In these schools, according to Bennett, Blackstock, and de la Ronde, the children were beat, abused, and treated very poorly. They had no contact with their family, as their family was not allowed to visit them, nor were they allowed to visit. When they finally were able to return home, they were traumatized and were the victims of many abuses suffered under the white man. They did not know how to cope, and there were no resources available for them or support. Many turned to addictions in the form of drugs and alcohol to cope from the hurt caused. According to LaFrance and Collins, many became parents after the residential schools and did not have any required parenting skills, and therefore the cycle of abuse continued as they abused their children, as that is what they were taught. Amongst this cycle of abuse, the Indigenous lost their culture, their language, their spirituality, and became entrenched in what the white man taught them. At one point, the Indigenous culture was spiritual, in tune with nature, accepting of all things and believing in a two-spirited way of life. They believed in the power of nature and the universe, in being accepting and tolerant of all ways of life. This way of thinking and being was tragically lost over time due to the white man's oppression and the white man forcing them into their beliefs and way of life. A 17-year-old Indigenous boy was living on the reserve and was struggling with his sexuality. He wanted to be a two-spirited being, and according to Allers, a two-spirited being refers to a person who has both a female and a male spirit, and that is their spiritual identity. He kept it to himself for many years, as he knew he would not be accepted by members of his reserve. He kept quiet and lived a lie until he finally could keep it in no longer and disclosed to his elder of his two-spirited identity. The elder looked sadly upon the boy and said, "You must leave the reserve, for you will not be accepted." Fear, homophobia, hate is how many Indigenous people now feel towards two-spirited sexualities. The injustices and the oppression they suffered from the white man has now turned them away from their culture and traditional ways of believing and thinking. The boy left the reserve with no money, no home, no family, and little education. Once in the white man's world, he met more hate, discrimination, and felt all alone. He felt helpless, hopeless, and defeated. He could not find a job as he faced discrimination for first being of the Indigenous population, and second, for identifying as a two-spirited being. With no other option, he was forced to make the streets his home, and finally turned to drugs, prostitution, and crime to survive. He was beaten, he was raped, he was thrown in jail. Still, his resilient spirit survived. He refused to give up on himself. One day, he couldn't take it anymore. He attempted to take his own life. He was unsuccessful with his suicide attempt, and he ended up in the hospital, feeling more scared, more hurt, and more alone than he ever had in his entire life. The door opened and someone entered the room. The boy turned and looked. It was the elder and another lady who accompanied the elder. The boy was confused and angry as the elder had rejected him. The elder then spoke and apologized to the boy. He introduced the lady as a social worker that supported the LGBTQ population and was willing to work with the boy to help him heal and find supports and resources so he could be his full two-spirited identity. The boy worked with various agencies and he was able to secure employment, housing, and continue his education. He then went on to educate and promote awareness amongst the Indigenous population to get back to their original culture of being a spiritual, accepting culture. We believe that in order to create a reconciliation and heal the Indigenous population, we need to support, educate, and raise awareness to bring back their traditional ways of thinking and acceptance of the Indigenous population. That is true resiliency and reconciliation.